Welcome to Module 11, Autism Spectrum Disorder. There is some variability with prevalence rates. However, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recently stated that about 1 in every 59 children are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. And these are a category of disorders that include autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and pervasive developmental disorders that are not otherwise specified. Autism spectrum disorders have no definitive cause or known cure, and they're characterized by impairment in 3 areas: social interaction, communication, and behavior. Many children with autism spectrum disorders improve with age and also with early intervention. However, there are many children also who require services throughout their lifetime. And this is a set of disorders that has terrific costs associated with it, both to the individual and family. In addition, there are enormous societal costs associated with systems interventions and other factors. One estimate suggests that the annual cost associated with these disorders ranges from $35 to $90 billion annually. So the following TED Talks are informative because they're first-person accounts of living with autism. Temple Grandin is quite popular and a very eloquent speaker about what it is about autism that actually is helpful, and that we need to rethink how we look at individuals with autism spectrum disorders.
I haven't told many people this, but in my head, I've got thousands of secret worlds all going on all at the same time. I'm also autistic. People tend to diagnose autism with really specific checkbox descriptions, but in reality, there's a whole variation as to what we're like. For instance, my little brother, he's very severely autistic. He's nonverbal, he can't talk at all, but I love to talk. People often associate autism with liking maths and science and nothing else, but I know so many autistic people who love being creative. But that is a stereotype, as the stereotypes of things are often, if not always, wrong. For instance, a lot of people who think autism and think Rain Man immediately. That's the common belief that every single autistic person is Dustin Hoffman, and that's not true. But that's not just with autistic people either. I've seen it with LGBTQ people, with women, with POC people. People are so afraid of variety that they try and fit everything into a tiny little box with really specific labels. Like, this is something that actually happened to me in real life. I Googled autistic people are, and it comes up with suggestions as to what you're going to type. I Googled autistic people are, and the top result was demons. That is the first thing that people think when they think autism. They know. One of the things I can do because I'm autistic, it's an ability rather than a disability, is I've got a very, very vivid imagination. Let me explain it to you a bit. It's like I'm walking into worlds most of the time. There's the real world, the world that we all share, and there's the world in my mind. And the world in my mind is often so much more real than the real world. It's very easy for me to let my mind loose because I don't try and fit myself into a tiny little box. That's one of the best things about being autistic. You don't have the urge to do that. You find what you want to do, you find a way to do it, and you get on with it. If I was trying to fit myself into a box, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have achieved half the things that I have now. There are problems, though. There are problems with being autistic, and there are problems with having too much imagination. School can be a problem in general, but having also to explain to a teacher on a daily basis that their lesson is inexplicably dull, and you are secretly taking refuge in a world inside your head in which you are not in that lesson, that adds to your list of problems. Also, when my imagination takes hold, my body takes on a life of its own. When something very exciting happens in my inner world, I've just got to run, I've got to rock backwards and forwards, or sometimes scream. Like this gives me so much energy, and I've got to have an outlet for all that energy. But I've done that ever since I was a child, ever since I was a tiny little girl, and my parents thought it was cute, so they didn't bring it up. But when I got into school, they didn't really agree that it was cute. It can be that people don't want to be friends with the girl that starts screaming in an algebra lesson. And this doesn't normally happen in this day and age, but it can be that people don't want to be friends with the autistic girl. It can be that people don't want to associate with anyone who or can't fit themselves into a box that's labeled normal. But that's fine with me, because it shorts the wheat from the chaff, and I can find which people are genuine and true, and I can pick these people as my friends. But if you think about it, what is normal? What does it mean? Imagine if that was the best compliment you ever received. Wow, you are really normal. Compliments are, you are extraordinary, or you step outside the box, you're amazing. So if people want to be these things, why are so many people striving to be normal? Why are people pouring their brilliant individual light into a mold? People are so afraid of variety that they try and force everyone, even if people who don't want to or can't, to become normal. There are like camps for LGBTQ people or autistic people to try and make them this normal. And that's terrifying that people would do that in this day and age. All in all, I won't trade my autism and my imagination for the world. Because I am autistic, I've presented documentaries for the BBC, I'm in the midst of writing a book, I'm doing this is fantastic. And one of the best things that I've achieved, that I consider to have achieved, is I've found ways of communicating with my little brother and sister, who, as I've said, are non-verbal, they can't speak. And people would often write off someone who's non-verbal, but that's silly because my little brother and sister are the best siblings that you could ever hope for. They're just the best, and I love them so much, and I care about them more than anything else. I'm going to leave you with one question. If we can't get inside the person's mind, no matter if they're autistic or not, instead of punishing anything that strives from normal, why not celebrate uniqueness and cheer every time someone unleashes their imagination? Thank you.
I think I'll start out and just talk a little bit about what exactly autism is. Autism is a very big continuum that goes from very severe, the child remains nonverbal, all the way up to brilliant scientists and engineers. And I actually feel at home here because there's a lot of autism genetics here. You wouldn't have any... It's a continuum of traits. When does a nerd turn into, Asperger, which is just mild autism? I mean, Einstein and Mozart and Tesla would all be probably diagnosed as autistic spectrum today. And one of the things that really is going to concern me is getting these kids to be the ones that are going to invent the next energy things, that Bill Gates talked about this morning. Okay, now if you want to understand autism animals, and I want to talk to you about different ways of thinking, you have to get away from verbal language. I think in pictures. I don't think in language. Now, the thing about the autistic mind is it attends to details. Okay, this is a test where you either have to pick out the big letters or pick out the little letters, and the autistic mind picks out the little letters more quickly. And the thing is, the normal brain ignores the details. Well, if you're building a bridge, details are pretty important because it'll fall down if you ignore the details. And one of my big concerns with a lot of policy things today is things are getting too abstract. People are getting away from doing hands-on stuff. I'm really concerned that a lot of the schools have taken out the hands-on classes because art and classes like that, those were the classes where I excelled. Okay, in my work with cattle, I noticed a lot of little things that most people don't notice would make the cattle balk. Like, for example, this flag waving right in front of the veterinary facility. This feed yard was going to tear down their whole veterinary facility. All they needed to do was move the flag. Rapid movement, contrast. In the early 70s, when I started, I got right down in the chutes to see what cattle were seeing. People thought that was crazy. A coat on a fence would make them balk. Shadows would make them balk. A hose on the floor. People weren't noticing these things. A chain hanging down. And that's shown very, very nicely in the movie. In fact, I loved the movie how they duplicated all my projects. That's the geek side. My drawings got the star in the movie, too. And actually, it's called Temple Grand and not Thinking in Pictures. So what is Thinking in Pictures? It's literally movies in your head. My mind works like Google for images. Now, when I was a young kid, I didn't know my thinking was different. I thought everybody thought in pictures. And then when I did my book, Thinking in Pictures, I started interviewing people about how they think. And I was shocked to find out that my thinking was quite different. Like if I say, think about a church steeple, most people get this sort of generalized, generic one. Now, maybe that's not true in this room, but it's going to be true in a whole lot of different places. I see only specific pictures. They flash up into my memory just like Google for pictures. And in the movie, they've got a great scene in there where the word shoe is said and a whole bunch of 50s and 60s shoes pop into my imagination. Okay, there's my childhood church, that's specific. There's some more, Fort Collins. Okay, how about famous ones? And they just kind of come up kind of like this, just really quickly, like Google for pictures. And they come up one at a time, and then I can think, well, okay, well, maybe we can have it snow, or we can have a thunderstorm. I can hold it there and turn them into videos. Now, visual thinking was a tremendous asset in my work designing cattle handling facilities. And I've worked really hard on improving how cattle are treated at the slaughter plant. I'm not going to go into any gucky slaughter slides. I've got that stuff up on YouTube if you want to look at it. But one of the things that I was able to do in my design work is I could actually test run a piece of equipment in my mind, just like a virtual reality computer system. And this is an aerial view of a recreation of one of my projects that was used in the movie. That was like just so super cool. And there were a lot of kind of Asperger types and autism types working out there on the movie set, too. But one of the things that really worries me is where's the younger version of those kids going today? They're not ending up in Silicon Valley where they belong. Now, one of the things I learned very early on, because I wasn't that social, is I had to sell my work and not myself. And the way I sold livestock jobs is I showed off my drawings, I showed off pictures of things. Another thing that helped me as a little kid is, boy, in the 50s, you were taught manners. You were taught you can't pull the merchandise off the shelves in the store and throw it around. Now, when kids get to be in 3rd or 4th grade, you might see that this kid's going to be a visual thinker, drawing in perspective. Now, I want to emphasize that not every autistic kid's going to be a visual thinker. Now, I had this brain scan done several years ago, and I used to joke around about having a gigantic internet trunk line going deep into my visual cortex. This is tensor imaging, and my great big internet trunk line is twice as big as the controls. The red lines there are me, and the blue lines are the sex and age-matched control. And there I got a gigantic one, and the control over there, the blue one, has got a really small one. And some of the research now is showing that people on the spectrum actually think with primary visual cortex. Now, the thing is, the visual thinker is just one kind of mind. You see, the autistic mind tends to be a specialist mind, good at one thing, bad at something else. And where I was bad was algebra. And I was never allowed to take geometry or trig. Gigantic mistake. I'm finding a lot of kids that need to skip algebra, go right to geometry and trig. Now, another kind of mind is the pattern thinker. More abstract. These are your engineers, your computer programmers. Now, this is pattern thinking. That praying mantis is made from a single sheet of paper. No Scotch tape, no cuts, and there in the background is the pattern for folding it. Here are the types of thinking. Photorealistic visual thinkers like me. Pattern thinkers, music and math minds. Some of these oftentimes have problems with reading. You also will see these kind of problems with kids that are dyslexic. You'll see these different kinds of minds. And then there's a verbal mind. They know every fact about everything. Now, another thing is the sensory issues. I was really concerned about having to wear this gadget on my face. And I came in half an hour beforehand so I could have it put on and kind of get used to it. And they got it bent so it's not hitting my chin. But sensory is an issue. Some kids are bothered by fluorescent lights. Others have problems with sound sensitivity. You know, it's going to be variable. Now, visual thinking gave me a whole lot of insight into the animal mind. Because think about it, an animal's a sensory-based thinker, not verbal. Thinks in pictures, thinks in sounds, thinks in smells. Think about how much information there is there on the local fire hydrant. He knows who's been there, when they were there, are they friend or foe? Is there anybody he can go mate with? There's a ton of information on that fire hydrant. It's all very detailed information. And looking at these kind of details gave me a lot of insight into animals. Now, the animal mind, and also my mind, puts sensory-based information into categories. Man on a horse and a man on the ground, that is viewed as two totally different things. You can have a horse that's been abused by a rider. They'll be absolutely fine with the veterinarian and with the horseshoer, but you can't ride him. You have another horse where maybe the horseshoer beat him up, and he'll be terrible for anything on the ground with the veterinarian, but a person can ride him. Cattle are the same way. Man on a horse, a man on foot, they're two different things. You see, it's a different picture. So I want you to think about just how specific this is. Now, this ability to put information into categories, I find a lot of people are not very good at this. Like when I'm out troubleshooting with equipment or problems with something in a plant, they don't seem to be able to figure out, do I have a training people issue or do I have something wrong with the equipment? In other words, categorize equipment problem from a people problem. I find a lot of people have difficulty doing that. Now, let's say I figure out, is an equipment problem, is it a minor problem with something simple I can fix, or is the whole design of the system wrong? People have a hard time figuring that out. Let's just look at something like, solving problems with, making airlines safer. Yeah, I'm a million-mile flyer. I do lots and lots of flying. And, like if I was at the FFA, what would I be doing a lot of direct observation of? It would be their airplane tails. 5 fatal wrecks in the last 20 years. Tail either came off or steering stuff inside the tail broke in some way. It's tails, pure and simple. And when the pilots walk around the plane, guess what? They can't see that stuff inside the tail. Now as I think about that, I'm pulling up all of that, specific information. It's specific. See, my thinking's bottom up. I take all the little pieces and I put the pieces together like a puzzle. Now here's a horse that was deathly afraid of black cowboy hats. He'd been abused by somebody with a black cowboy hat. White cowboy hats, that was absolutely fine. Now the thing is, the world is going to need all of the different kinds of minds to work together. We've got to work on developing all these different kinds of minds. And one of the things that's driving me really crazy as I travel around and I do autism meetings is I'm seeing a lot of smart, geeky, nerdy kids. And they just aren't very social. And nobody's working on developing their interest in something like science. And this brings up the whole thing of my science teacher. My science teacher is shown absolutely beautifully in the movie. I was a goofball student when I was in high school. I just didn't care at all about studying until I had Mr. Carlock's science class. He was now Dr. Carlock in the movie. And he got me challenged to figure out an optical illusion room. This brings up the whole thing of you got to show kids interesting stuff. One of the things that I think maybe TED ought to do is tell all the schools about all the great lectures that are on TED. And there's all kinds of great stuff on the internet to get these kids turned on. Because I'm seeing a lot of these geeky, nerdy kids, and the teachers out in the Midwest and other parts of the country, when you get away from these tech areas, they don't know what to do with these kids. And they're not going down the right path. The thing is, you can make a mind to be more of a thinking and cognitive mind, or a mind can be wired to be more social. And what some of the research now has shown in autism is there may be extra wiring back here in the really brilliant mind, and we lose a few social circuits here. It's kind of a trade-off between thinking and social. And then you can get into the point where it's so severe, you're going to have a person that's going to be nonverbal. In the normal human mind, language covers up the visual thinking we share with animals. This is the work of Dr. Bruce Miller, and he studied Alzheimer's patients that had frontal temporal lobe dementia, and the dementia ate out the language parts of the brain, and then this artwork came out of somebody that used to install stereos in cars. Now, Van Gogh doesn't know anything about physics, but I think it's very interesting that there was some work done to show that this eddy pattern in this painting followed a statistical model of turbulence. This brings up the whole interesting idea of maybe some of this mathematical patterns is in our own head. And the Wolfram stuff, I was taking notes and I was writing down all the search words I could use, because I think that's going to go on in my autism lectures. We've got to show these kids interesting stuff. And they've taken out the auto shop class and the drafting class and the art class. I mean, art was my best subject in school. We've got to think about all these different kinds of minds, and we've got to absolutely work with these kind of minds, because we absolutely are going to need these kind of people in the future. And let's talk about jobs. Okay, my science teacher got me studying because I was a goofball that didn't want to study. But you know what? I was getting work experience. I'm seeing too many of these smart kids that haven't learned basic things like how to be on time. I was taught that when I was 8 years old. You know, how to have table manners at Granny's Sunday party. I was taught that when I was very, very young. And when I was 13, I had a job at a dressmaker's shop selling clothes. I did internships in college. I was building things. And I also had to learn how to do assignments. You know, all I wanted to do was draw pictures of horses when I was little. Mother said, well, let's do a picture of something else. They've got to learn how to do something else. Let's say the kid's fixated on Legos. Let's get them working on building different things. The thing about the autistic mind is it tends to be fixated. Like if the kid loves race cars, let's use race cars for math. Let's figure out how long it takes a race car to go a certain distance. In other words, use that fixation in order to motivate that kid. That's one of the things we need to do. And really get fed up when the teachers, especially when you get away from this part of the country, they don't know what to do with these smart kids. It just drives me crazy. What can visual thinkers do when they grow up? They can do graphic design, all kinds of stuff with computers, photography, industrial design. The pattern thinkers, they're the ones that are going to be your mathematicians, your software engineers, your computer programmers, all of those kinds of jobs. And then you've got the word minds. They make great journalists, and they also make really, really good stage actors. Because the thing about being autistic is I had to learn social skills like being in a play. You just have to learn it. And we need to be working with these students, and this brings up mentors. You know, my science teacher was not an accredited teacher. He was a NASA space scientist. Now, some states now are getting it to where if you have a degree in biology or a degree in chemistry, you can come into the school and teach, biology or chemistry. We need to be doing that. Because what I'm observing is the good teachers for a lot of these kids are out in the community colleges. But we need to be getting some of these good teachers into the high schools. Another thing that can be very, very, very successful is there's a lot of people that may have retired from, working in the software industry. And they can teach a kid. And it doesn't matter if what they teach them is old. Because what you're doing is you're lighting the spark. You're getting that kid turned on. And you get them turned on, then you'll learn all the new stuff. Mentors are just essential. I cannot emphasize enough what my science teacher did for me. And we've got to mentor them, hire them. And if you bring them in for internships in your companies, the thing about the autism, Asperger kind of mind, you got to give them a specific task. Don't just say design new software. You got to tell them something a lot more specific. Well, we're designing software for a phone, and it has to do some specific thing, and it can only use so much memory. That's the kind of specificity you need. Well, that's the end of my talk, and I just want to thank everybody for coming. It was great to be here. Okay. Oh, you have a question for me?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. You once wrote, I like this quote, "If by some magic autism had been eradicated from the face of the earth, then men would still be socializing in front of a wood fire at the entrance to a cave."
Because who do you think made the first stone spear? It was the Asperger guy, and if you were to get rid of all the autism genetics, there'd be no more Silicon Valley, and the energy crisis would not be solved.
So I want to ask you a couple other questions, and you know, if any of these feel inappropriate, it's okay just to say next question. But if there's someone here who has an autistic child or knows an autistic child and feels kind of cut off from them, what advice would you give them?
Well, first of all, we got to look at age. If you have a 2-, 3-, or 4-year-old, you know, no speech, no social interaction, I can't emphasize enough, don't wait. You need at least 20 hours a week of one-to-one teaching. You know, the thing is, autism comes in different degrees. There's going to be about half the people on the spectrum that are not going to learn to talk, and they're not going to be working in Silicon Valley. That would not be a reasonable thing for them to do. But then you got these smart, geeky kids, you know, the touch of autism, and that's where you've got to get them turned on with doing interesting things. I got social interaction through shared interests. I rode horses with other kids. I made model rockets with other kids. Did electronics lab, you know, with other kids. And in the 60s, it was gluing mirrors onto rubber membrane on speaker to make a light show. That was like, we consider that super cool.
Is it unrealistic for them to hope or think that that child loves them, as some might most wish?
Well, let me tell you, that child will be loyal, and if your house is burning down, they're going to get you out of it.
Wow. So most people, if you ask them what are they most passionate about, they'd say things like, my kids, or my lover, or what are you most passionate about?
I'm passionate about that the things I do are going to make the world a better place. When I have a mother of an autistic child say, my kid went to college because of your book or something, or one of your lectures, that makes me happy. You know, the slaughter plants, I've worked with them in the 80s. They were absolutely awful. I developed a really simple scoring system for slaughter plants where you just measure outcomes. How many cattle fell down, how many cattle got poked with a prodder, how many cattle are mooing their heads off. And it's very, very simple. You directly observe a few simple things. It's worked really well. I get satisfaction out of seeing stuff that makes real change in the real world. We need a lot more of that and a lot less abstract stuff.
When we were talking on the phone, one of the things you said that really astonished me was, you said one thing you were passionate about was server farms. Tell me about that.
Well, the reason why I got really excited and I read about that, it contains knowledge. It's libraries. And to me, knowledge is something that is extremely valuable. So maybe over 10 years ago now, our library got flooded, and this is before the internet got really big, and I was really upset about all the books being wrecked because it was knowledge being destroyed. And server farms or data centers are great libraries of knowledge.
Temple, can I just say it's an absolute delight to have you at TED.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
What are the current practice models for autism spectrum disorders? Early intervention. That is absolutely critical. There are several autism centers across the United States that focus primarily on early intervention. However, treatment will vary based upon the age of the child, the type of autism spectrum disorder, and so a constellation of services is usually required. That might include behavioral therapy, speech and occupational therapy. There may be co-occurring medical issues that need to be addressed. And typically, you'll find a multidisciplinary team composed that is somewhat individualized per child, providing a set of services. In terms of therapeutic approaches for the emotional health or behavioral health side of autism spectrum disorders, there's 3 that are somewhat mainstay treatments, and the first is applied behavior analysis. And applied behavior analysis, or ABA, derives from several theoretical models. What it does is it aims to change behavior and breaking down a skill or a behavior into its parts and reinforcing those parts until the entire skill is learned. In behavioral therapy, this is also referred to as shaping. So for example, you want your child to clean their room, they're not doing it, or you want them to get dressed in the morning And that is, or get ready for school in the morning, and that is a large set of behaviors that for some kids is difficult to do. So you would break down those behaviors, that goal, which is getting ready and out the door in the morning, into different parts. So it might be brushing your teeth, brushing your hair, putting on your clothes, getting your backpack ready for school, putting your shoes on, reinforcing each one of those steps. And in behavior therapy, which is somewhat different than ABA, so just throwing that out there, we look for a behavior to occur between 4 to 6 days before we add another one. So Johnny is brushing his teeth for 4 to 6 days. We reinforce that, and then we add brushing teeth and brushing hair. And to get the reinforcement, Johnny then has to do both behaviors, and that's how you successively approximate or partialize a skill into the whole behavior. In addition, there's sensory integration therapy, and that's delivered by occupational therapists, using play to alter how the child reacts to sound, sight, movement, and so forth. And it's not uncommon to treat some of the irritability, anxiety, depression that may co-occur with autism spectrum disorders through psychopharmacology. Here is a video that is somewhat short on YouTube that describes or presents how ABA is conducted.
Most often, parents already know that their child has autism. They're just waiting for an expert to sit down with them and formally diagnose it. There are times where a parent doesn't know that's going on and comes into the appointment unaware of what it's called.
Now we just have one diagnosis called autism spectrum disorder. Previously, it was broken up into succinct categories. And the categories were to help people understand different levels and different functioning levels of kids and persons with autism. Now it's all one disorder, and then we talk about different severity levels and functioning levels.
Autism is sometimes the A word that you don't want to hear it because you think it's going to be terrible, but autism is a spectrum, and there are children that have just a little bit of autism and who are in the mild range.
So a low functioning person on the spectrum would have intense behaviors that are impeding their ability to be independent in their life, little to no communication skills, unable to interact with other people and their environment without additional supports. Then you're going to have the higher functioning level spectrum. So in the past it used to be called Asperger's disorder. People who have more of the stereotypic behaviors, repetitive interests, but their communication skills are there. They can communicate with other people, they can interact with others, but they still have some challenges and some barriers in those areas.
So difficulty with socializing with other kids, repetitive behaviors, such as toe walking, rocking, spinning. Those are the classic signs. The kids who are classically autism, you can almost diagnose right in the waiting room as soon as you greet them. They're fairly obvious, and pediatricians are generally good at identifying those.
If they're a young child, some of the things that you want to look for are a lack of eye contact, lack of being able to engage in pretend play. So for example, if you have a toddler and they are not interacting with baby dolls, they're not really using them to try to play, pretend to rock them or put them to bed. Another one would be social interaction. So oftentimes they prefer to be alone as opposed to be with other people. They don't start interacting with other kids. We call that parallel play, moving to more of an interactive play. They prefer to just continue to stay solitary.
Many kids with autism spectrum disorder have these heightened sensitivities to things tactile, things auditory, things olfactory and thermal. And as a result of that, they often recoil from situations and develop an intolerance for being in certain places and in certain environments. And the reason many of these kids have food-related issues is because of sensitivities that they have from an oral standpoint. They can't tolerate various textures in their mouth. They can't tolerate the smell of food or even the taste of food, for example. So those would all be some early indicators.
I think parents are afraid of the label of autism sometimes and afraid that this is going to change the course of their child's life. And really, I've had no one come back and say they wish they hadn't labeled their child autism, because in beginning to accept a diagnosis of autism starts the therapy for it. So it really opens up their world. It doesn't close it down.
The origins of ABA therapy harken back to the research of a groundbreaking psychologist by the name of B.F. Skinner. Dr. Skinner believed that behavior is changeable through positive reinforcement. Skinner found through his research that we all learn through the consequences of behavior. Behavior that is reinforced tends to rewire us and becomes our default behavior. He also found that behavior that is not reinforced will dissipate over time. Skinner's research is commonly seen in every one of our lives. As children, we learn to walk, talk, and avoid picking up hot things through repetitive training from our parents or loved ones. We learn most of our basic life skills through repetitive reinforcement. Reinforcers are essentially the outcomes of the rewards or consequences from our own behaviors. For example, rewarding a child for cleaning his room with money is a positive reinforcer. Cheering a child as she takes her first steps conveys to the child that the awkwardness of her first steps is worth the risk. ABA therapy simply expands this training in intensive ways until each child struggling with autism reaches new milestones and develops the habits he will need to live a full life as an adult.
ABA therapy is changing behavior by looking at what is reinforcing the behavior. So things that happen after a behavior occurs, where you can either expect that behavior to continue or expect that behavior to stop. And we look at the principles of learning in how we can change that behavior. So can we set up specific environmental situations, we call those antecedents, to ascertain a specific behavior? And then if the behavior happens that we want, how do we reinforce it so that we can expect that behavior to occur again in the future?
They have the way to help kids with autism down to a fine science that has little tiny goals that get added together to take a child from not being able to interact with other kids, being focused on their own internal world, into kids that can tolerate other kids, can be at school, can follow circle time, can answer questions for you, can get their needs met, can communicate. And that doesn't come from broad sweeping goals. It comes from this daily battle with these kids with tiny little goals.
Let's say we were trying to teach a child colors, and we've got some different objects out for them, and we're trying to teach them which one is the red object. And they just keep picking the yellow one over and over. So there's different principles of behavior, there's different learning strategies that we may use where we elicit the behavior that we're looking for, we elicit the response that we're looking for. So we may move the red apple a little bit closer to them. That would be one type of prompt that we could use. And then when they pick the red apple, that's the red object that we were looking for, then we would give them some kind of reinforcer. It could be praise, it could be a high five, it could be something that they like, an edible item, it could be a toy for them to play with, something to let them know that the behavior that they just had, or the response that they just gave us, is what we were looking for, and that's a good thing. And then we would expect, based on that principle of reinforcement, that the next time that we ask them the same question, which is the red object, that they would be able to give us the correct answer.
So they're going to first be able to point to a choice between two objects, and they're going to be able to point between two pictures of what they desire. Then they're going to be able to say one of the words, and they're going to be able to request one of the words. And that process takes weeks to develop, but if they can slowly work at it, they'll get the child there. So at home, parents can be frustrated for years that they can't understand what their kid wants, they can't communicate with their child, and they don't have the time and the expertise to know what are the little steps that their kid needs to make to get there. ABA therapists know that and have the time, because it is one-on-one therapy at such an intense level. They get the child to where they need to be, which seemed impossible before ABA existed.
It doesn't matter, whether an individual has a physical disability or a cognitive disability, that they're not diminished in terms of value from anybody else. And I think that just becomes something so critical to keep in mind daily as you're interacting with individuals, is the preciousness and the beauty of a life, and just communicating that value to them in every possible way, and communicating your understanding of that value to your community is just critically important.
If any of the mental health conditions and issues we've talked about thus far have called for the need for emerging programs and practice models, this autism spectrum disorders is definitely at the forefront for several reasons. First, like PTSD, there's been no individual or singular treatment that treats the core symptoms of ASD. So usually there's a constellation of services addressing different issues, as I mentioned a couple of slides back. There's also no uniform agreement on which treatments are effective. Lack of access to treatment and cost are significant barriers to access. And lack of access means there's a shortage of providers, extensive wait lists for services. Many caregivers suggest or have stated that they're dissatisfied with conventional treatments, particularly ABA. There's a lot of controversy around that therapeutic approach. In addition, treatments can be time consuming, so ABA may be administered up to 40 hours per week. And for the psychopharmacological agents, there are safety issues and potential side effects that caregivers are concerned about. So we're going to break down the emerging programs and practice models into two large categories: ingestibles and non-ingestibles. Ingestibles range from melatonin, which is a neurohormone used as a sleep aid, to vitamins, to chelation therapy, which is a process of removing heavy metals from the body, folic acid, probiotics, fatty acids, and so forth. Non-ingestibles are going to be familiar to you because we've discussed them in prior modules: equine assisted therapy, music and art therapy, and then the mind-body exercise, acupuncture, massage therapy, and other alternative treatments. So remember from Module 7, when we talked about trauma, that there are multiple types of equine assisted therapies and the theory behind them. For individuals with autism spectrum disorders, equine therapy is reported to help facilitate emotional bonding with the horse, cognitive and language development, sensory processing as well through the horse's movement. So you're getting benefit through riding and interacting with the horse, as well as the horse's gait, which can be regulatory through in terms of their sensory processing. There are many stables in Connecticut, primarily the upper New Hampshire, Maine. There's actually equine facilitated therapy programs at several universities. This is a very popular approach. It's growing in popularity. And this video shows you a little bit about what equine assisted therapy entails for kids with autism spectrum disorders.
A bright sunny day in rural Licking County. And at the Edgewood Equestrian Program, a busy day begins. These are the therapists.
You want a treat? You do? Say yes.
And their patients are children with special needs, many on the autism spectrum.
We're a traditional riding program, but the autistic kids that come here aren't required to ride, but all of them have. And all of them have almost immediately.
Lynn and Russ Edgington are the heart of the Pegasus program. The goal is communication with horses as the teachers. Andy Wilmore has been coming here for 6 years.
Keep on going. Yeah, there's no stopping right here.
And has found relief for his Asperger's symptoms.
The horse can put you at ease. You can help with the horse at ease just by thinking and how that thought translates into the body.
What do you love about this horse?
She takes care of me.
Indeed she does. So what is it about the horses, the setting, the moment?
I absolutely am a believer that horses are magical. They're super sensitive. The feelings, the energy, something that transpires between the horse and the person is beyond words.
Think of yourself as a team with these horses?
Yes, there is a mutuality to it. There is a bonding between the rider and the horse. And that takes time to grow, but it's really, really worth it.
Music and art therapy are additional approaches. There are theories behind both of them. Music therapy, for example, is theorized to help children with ASDs through activating brain hemispheres, both of the brain hemispheres, facilitating cognitive activity, encouraging communication and social interaction with others. Art therapy is, especially for individuals who have such severe autism spectrum disorders that they may not be verbal. So it allows for communication and encourages, again, social interaction, communication, and sensory integration. The Robbins Center down at NYU is at the forefront of providing music therapy for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And so this clip is a news article about basically the premise behind it and the work that they do. And then we have a host of alternative treatments. And those can include massage therapy, exercise, acupuncture, hyperbaric chambers, or a constellation of approaches. So let's critically appraise the evidence. Several of these approaches are safe and inexpensive. Exercise, for example, perhaps art therapy. However, many are based on unproven theories. So the theory behind chelation therapy is that heavy metals cause toxicity in children, leading to autism spectrum disorders. There are studies that suggest that certain ingestibles, such as melatonin and multivitamins, are helpful for some of the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, including sleep disturbances and so forth, as well as the mind-body alternative therapies such as massage, exercise, and equine-assisted therapy. Studies have also looked at omega-3 fatty acids, acupuncture, a modified version of mindfulness-based practices, massage therapy, and the hormone oxytocin. And here the research is mixed, and again it calls standardization into question. Also of consideration, some of these therapeutic approaches are quite controversial. So chelation therapy, hyperbaric oxygen, secretion, fungal agents, they're potentially dangerous as well. Special diets may help some individuals with autism spectrum disorders, but they need to be carefully monitored while on the diet. Some are on high-fat, very low carbohydrate diets, and that has been associated with a reduction in seizure activity. But again, that should be done under the supervision of a medical professional, and The concern is that that might not always be taking place. Critically, we know that applied behavior analysis and these other therapeutic approaches that are conventional have been studied extensively and show benefit across domains. So, for example, ABA is the forefront of treatments for behavior problems. However, up to 90% of caregivers have expressed using complementary and alternative treatments for autism spectrum disorders and using a constellation of those therapeutic approaches. So how do we make treatment recommendations, and how do we decide whether a given therapeutic approach is appropriate and will be useful to the clients that we're working with? Contextually, you'll also need to consider the larger political and fiscal landscape in which treatment for autism spectrum disorders is occurring. There are several advocacy organizations. The link up here takes you to Autism Speaks, which is one such organization that provides families with a wealth of information about the research initiatives being undertaken, advocacy opportunities, best practices, and so forth. So there's a lot of movement behind developing and testing these alternative therapeutic approaches because, in large part, of dissatisfaction with conventional treatments and the difficulty that they run into, such as for treating PTSD. There's really not one treatment that addresses all the needs of individuals with ASDs. As you can imagine or have intuited at this point, that there are clear ethical issues that may be in play when we're using alternative therapeutic approaches that lack evidence, A, or B, are potentially dangerous. So those ethical issues also propel us forward in terms of the translational research that is needed in order to discern the effects of these treatments. Also, if you look at the National Institutes of Health, they have taken this seriously, and they have created funding opportunities to study alternative treatments for mental health problems such as ASDs. Also, some innovators, such as Yale, which is really at the forefront of autism research, has, and there's a link here for you to read more about this, has developed a personalized, patient-centered approach to autism spectrum disorders. So maybe they, in recognition that there is no singular therapeutic approach that is effective, maybe that calls for us to use an individualized case-by-case approach. And also, we need to change our thinking about autism spectrum disorders. So heavily pathologized in the past, innovators such as Temple Grandin have been instrumental in seeing the benefit, and that folks with autism spectrum disorders can contribute immensely to society and can lead fulfilling lives. All right, we are at the end of Module 11, and our last module is using translational research in clinical practice.